What would you do if your job was chosen the day you were born? What if your only future was to scrub someone else's chamber pot? Or work in a coal mine at age 7? In the 1800s, your last name meant more than your talent. Your gender dictated your wage. And climbing the social ladder was almost impossible, unless you married rich. Or died trying. But here's the twist. Behind the lords and ladies, there were chimney sweeps, rat catchers, washerwomen, and child seamstresses, whose stories rarely make the textbooks, yet built the world we live in. From castles to coal pits, parlors to prisons, this is not just history. This is survival. And if you think life was simple back then, you're in for a shock. Stay with me, because every detail you're about to hear might just change the way you look at work, class, and your own life today. It's hard to imagine today, but in the 1800s, the social class you were born into wasn't just a label. It was your destiny. Picture this. 2 children born on the very same day in 1851. One is wrapped in fine linen, cradled in a mahogany crib, beside a roaring fireplace. The other is born beneath a leaking roof, wrapped in rags, soot already etched into his mother's hands. Their futures? Already written. Because in the 19th century, class wasn't a suggestion, it was law, custom, culture, and expectation, all rolled into one. You didn't just live in a different neighborhood from the rich if you were poor. You walked differently, spoke differently, you breathed different air, sometimes quite literally. The social pyramid was steep and unforgiving. At the top, royalty, aristocrats, landed gentry. These were people who didn't work in the way we think of it. Their job was to manage estates, host social functions, marry strategically, and, if male, possibly sit in parliament. Then came the upper middle class, merchants, bankers, doctors, and professionals who had carved out space through education or inheritance. But below them was a growing mass of the struggling, artisans, clerks, schoolteachers, and then, further still, the industrial workers, the maids, the laundresses, the coal miners, the street vendors, people who labored 16 hours a day just to afford a loaf of bread and a roof shared with rats. And if you were a woman? The ladder was twice as high and half as wide. Even among the wealthy, your marriage determined your status more than your mind ever could. You could be born into luxury and still be treated as property. Or born into poverty and find that work itself was never enough to rise above it. It wasn't just about wealth. It was about permission. Who had the right to speak in court? To go to school? To own land? In most cases, not the people who needed it most. A real example, in England, a maid named Mary Smith worked for the same family for 37 years. She rose each day before sunrise, washed and dressed the children she could never have, polished silver she'd never touch at her own table, and died with no savings because service, even faithful, lifelong service, was seen as duty, not labor worth reward. In the United States, even as the country prided itself on freedom and democracy, class inequality was embedded deep. The industrial age widened the gap. The rich built railroads, the poor died building them. And so we come to a quiet truth. In the 19th century, the greatest divide wasn't just between rich and poor, it was between those who were allowed to dream and those who weren't. But here's the lesson no one told in school. Social class wasn't just a structure. It was a story, repeated generation after generation, until people believed it was unchangeable. And yet, quietly, in back alleys and servants' quarters, some began to challenge that script. Because even in the most rigid systems, cracks always form. And within those cracks lived the people whose jobs kept the world running, people we'll now turn our eyes to. Next, let's walk through the manicured gardens and chandelier-lit halls of the wealthy. And ask, was it really all silk and roses? Or did the upper class carry burdens of their own? Let's find out. At first glance, life among the upper class in the 19th century seemed like a dream. Grand homes with glittering chandeliers, velvet drapes, silver spoons, horse-drawn carriages, no soot under the nails, no factory bells to obey. But as with many dreams, this one came with its own price, and not all of it was paid in coin. To be born into the aristocracy or high society wasn't just a stroke of luck. It was a lifelong role, one that came with a script, a costume, and 1,000 invisible rules. From the moment a child could walk, they were trained in etiquette, posture, Conversation. Laughter had a proper volume. Emotions had a proper time. Meals followed a precise order. And even one's silence had to be performed with grace. Consider Lady Eleanor Fitzwilliam, fictional in name, but very real in her routine. She rose not with the sun, but when her lady's maid brought in the tea tray. She would be dressed, not by choice, but by social expectation, corsets laced tight, hair curled in a dozen pins, layers upon layers of fabric draped on her frame. Her day was filled not with leisure, but with appearances, receiving guests, writing letters, attending luncheons, supervising the housekeeper, perhaps playing the piano or walking the garden. Always graceful, always polished, but never, ever free, because despite all the wealth, an upper-class woman owned nothing, not even herself. Her education, if she had one, centered on accomplishments, embroidery, French, maybe a bit of poetry. Her future depended almost entirely on marriage. Not love, not compatibility. Marriage, a transaction that would elevate or maintain her family's name. If she married well, she was celebrated. If she didn't, she was a burden. Men, too, had roles to play. A gentleman might attend Oxford, hunt foxes, and inherit an estate, but even privilege came with pressure. An heir was expected to uphold the family name, expand the fortune, avoid scandal. Emotions, vulnerabilities, fears, they had no place in polite society. Even in America, where class lines were blurrier than in Europe, the elite had their own gilded cages. The daughters of railroad barons or cotton kings were paraded in social seasons. Their mothers fought for invitations to the right ballroom, the right picnic, the right gentleman's arm. Behind the glamour lay anxiety. One wrong move, one poor marriage, one whiff of gossip, and an entire family's reputation could collapse. What made it worse was the constant performance. Every minute of every day was watched, judged, compared, and while the poor labored with their hands, the rich labored with their image. Of course, wealth brought comfort, access, opportunities, but it didn't guarantee happiness. In fact, many upper-class women suffered silently from depression, isolation, even addiction, trapped in mansions where they could not speak their minds or follow their hearts. And here lies the quiet lesson. Privilege does not always mean power. The upper class was often as trapped by expectation as the lower class was by poverty. Their cage was just gilded. So while the world envied their pearls and their pearls envied the world, another group lived in the same houses, but slept in the attics and worked in the shadows. The servants, they saw everything, the secrets, the shame, the rituals, and kept the whole illusion running. Let's now follow them below the grand staircases, beyond the ornate doors, into the kitchens and cellars, where a different kind of life played out. The life of those who served. If the upper class lived in mansions and the poor in alleys, the middle class dwelled somewhere in between, straddling cobblestones and chandeliers. Respectability and ruin, and yet, they were often the ones who believed in the system the most. Because the middle class was built on one powerful idea, that if you worked hard enough, you could rise. But the truth? It was never that simple. In the 19th century, the middle class was not a single block of people, but a spectrum. It included shopkeepers who opened their shutters before dawn, schoolteachers who corrected ink-stained papers by candlelight, and accountants who copied rows of numbers by hand, praying not to make a single error. It also included small-time lawyers, junior clerks in bustling firms, struggling writers, and independent seamstresses trying to earn enough to buy more thread. Take Mr. Harold Bennett, again. A fictional name, but a familiar life. Harold worked 6 days a week as a bank clerk in London. He wore a modest suit, always clean but never new. Every morning he joined the swarm of top hats on the street, trying to walk a little taller, speak a little more properly, read the right newspaper on the tram. He was neither rich nor poor, but he carried the pressure of both. He feared falling into poverty, yet could only dream of true wealth. His family depended on his image as much as his income. They couldn't afford servants, but still kept a parlor for company. They couldn't send their children to elite schools, but they insisted on piano lessons because appearances mattered. In America, the story was similar. The rise of commerce and industry gave birth to an ambitious, fragile class of strivers. These were the men who ran general stores, printed local papers, or managed telegraph offices. These were the women who taught school by day and embroidered at night to make ends meet. They believed in progress, in modest success, in the idea that their children might go further. But the margin for error was razor thin. One illness, one failed investment, one bad harvest, and everything could collapse. There were no safety nets, no health insurance, no unemployment benefits. Pride often kept them from seeking help even when they needed it most. And so, they lived in a quiet kind of fear, a fear of slipping down. Because once you slipped into the working poor, climbing back up was a brutal, narrow road. The middle class often saw itself as the moral backbone of society, educated, decent, orderly. But this self-image came with burdens, a need to act proper, to discipline emotions, to distance themselves from both the wealthy, whom they quietly envied, and the poor, whom they often judged. Yet, there was beauty too, in the music played on second-hand pianos, in Sunday suits worn with pride, even if threadbare, in the smell of fresh bread from a family-run bakery. The middle class didn't live in grandeur, but in hope. They were the dreamers and the doers, the ones who believed that someday their children might become doctors, engineers, or respected ladies. Still, for all their efforts, they often found themselves stuck, caught in routines, office hours, and societal rules that echoed those of the classes above and below them. The myth of upward mobility was real enough to chase, but slippery enough to rarely catch. And here's the quiet lesson: sometimes, the greatest struggle isn't poverty. It's holding on to what little you've earned while reaching for more in a world that doesn't quite let you have it. And while the middle class penned letters and counted coins, another class was rising, not in status, but in numbers. The laborers, the ones who worked with fire, dust, and muscle, who didn't wear top hats or write in ledgers. They wore soot. Let's now descend into the smoky factories, the echoing halls of spinning machines and molten iron, to see what life was like for those whose backs built the cities we live in today. While the middle class balanced on the tightrope of respectability, below them stood the true engine of the 19th century, the factory workers and miners. They didn't wear collars stiff with starch or sit behind mahogany desks. Their tools were hammers, shovels, and their own calloused hands. Their lives were measured not in pay raises, but in broken bones and soot-covered lungs. These were the people who made the wheels of industry turn, quite literally. They forged iron, spun cotton, mined coal, and fired up the furnaces that powered entire cities. Their labor built the railroads, powered the steamships, and clothed the world. And yet, they were often treated as disposable. Imagine a young boy named Samuel, no older than 10, crouched in a coal mine in Pennsylvania. It's dark, the air is damp and choking with dust. He uses a pick to chip away at a wall of rock, pausing only when a rat skitters past or when his hands bleed too much to grip. He earns a few cents a day. There's no school, no sunlight, no safety, but this is the only way his family can eat. Or picture a girl named Eliza in Manchester, England, working in a textile mill. She's 12, her shift began at 6 a.m. and will end when the sun is long gone. Her fingers are nimble, perfect for reaching into the spinning frames to untangle threads. But one mistake, one moment too slow, and her hand might be caught in the machinery. Many girls her age lose fingers. Some lose more. And yet, they keep showing up, because there is no choice. Factories and mines were places of noise, sweat, and constant danger. In many mills, the air was filled with cotton fibers that damaged the lungs. In coal mines, gas leaks and cave-ins were a constant threat. There were no regulations, no labor laws. If you died on the job, there would be another worker ready to take your place by morning. Despite this, workers formed tight-knit communities. They shared food, songs, and stories. They looked after one another's children, even as they buried too many of their own. They found pride in survival, because every day lived was an act of quiet resistance. The industrial boom made fortunes for factory owners and investors. But the workers saw little of it. Their wages barely covered rent and food. Many lived in cramped tenements with no plumbing and disease-ridden streets. And when they dared to strike for better conditions, they were often met with violence from police, from hired thugs, even from the law itself. Still, they endured. They kept the fires burning and the machines turning. And here's the lesson we often forget. Progress isn't built in boardrooms. It's built on backs. Every bridge, every rail, every piece of cloth was made by someone who worked until their body gave out. And yet, most of their names are lost to history. But beneath all this hardship, there was something powerful growing: awareness. The realization that they were not alone. That the system needed them more than it admitted. And with that awareness came whispers of rebellion, solidarity, and eventually, change. Before that storm fully rose, though, there was another group of workers, often silent, often invisible, but essential to the world above them. They didn't build factories or dig tunnels. They scrubbed floors, lit lamps, and served meals in houses they didn't own. Next, let's step behind the doors of the great houses, down the servant staircases and into the kitchens, to meet the quiet souls who kept the upper class running. One task at a time. The domestic servants. Beneath the marble floors and velvet drapes of the grand houses lived an entirely different world. It was quieter, more hidden, but it never slept. This was the world of domestic servants, maids, footmen, cooks, scullery girls, butlers, and nannies, whose lives unfolded in basements, attics, and stairwells the wealthy rarely noticed. They were the shadows of the household, always present, rarely acknowledged, and without them, the entire illusion of aristocratic grace would have crumbled overnight. To be a servant in the 19th century was to live a life of routine, obedience, and erasure. A maid like Clara might rise at 4 in the morning to light the fireplaces in rooms she wasn't allowed to sit in. She'd scrub chamber pots, polish brass, beat rugs, and wash linens, all before breakfast was even served. Her clothes were plain, her hands always chapped, her name often forgotten. In many grand houses, there were strict rules. Servants must not be seen or heard. They entered through separate doors, ate in separate quarters, and walked up narrow servant staircases so the family never had to encounter them. They waited silently during dinners, changed bed linens with military precision, and kept secrets they weren't meant to know. But they knew everything. They knew who cried behind locked doors, which marriages were loveless, which letters came late at night. They saw the cracks behind the polished veneer, and they carried those truths in silence, knowing that one misstep, a broken plate, a delayed tea, a misplaced look, could cost them their job. Wages were meager, time off was rare, and personal freedom was virtually non-existent. Many servants sent most of their pay home to support younger siblings or aging parents. Others had no one left and stayed in service until their bodies gave out, only to be replaced the next day. Yet within this strict and thankless system, many found pride in their work. A head butler might take deep satisfaction in a perfectly managed household. A cook might be known for pies that guests raved about. A nanny might love the children she raised as if they were her own, though she'd never be permitted to say so. There were small victories, a quiet moment by the kitchen fire, a note of thanks from a child, a day off to visit a sick mother. These moments didn't change their status, but they reminded them they were still human. In America, domestic service was no easier. Immigrant women, especially Irish and German, filled the kitchens of wealthy urban families. They worked long hours for little pay, often facing prejudice and isolation. But they, too, endured, because survival wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it was simply getting through another day. And here's the quiet truth that history tends to overlook. The rich may have owned the houses, but it was the servants who made them livable. Their work wasn't glamorous, it wasn't honored, but it was essential. They were the heartbeat of the home, steady, unseen, and always expected. But not everyone served in still rooms and polished halls. Some moved from town to town, from street corner to street corner, chasing coins wherever they could. They carried wares on their backs, sharpened knives in alleyways, sold songs for pennies. Let's now step outside the mansions and into the streets, to meet the peddlers, tinkers, and wanderers who lived by their wits and walked the world without a roof to call their own. Not everyone in the 19th century had a master to serve or a factory to report to. Some worked outside the walls, the mines, and the system itself. They were the drifters, the tradesmen on foot, the singers by street corners. They were peddlers, tinkers, and vagabonds, and though they rarely appear in the history books, their lives were as full, as fragile, and as necessary as any other. These were the people who carried their trades on their backs. A peddler might haul pots, ribbons, scissors, or spices from village to village, calling out wares to passers-by in the hope of a few coins. A tinker, often Irish or Romani, would offer to mend kettles, sharpen blades, or repair broken tools, his hands blackened with soot and years of road dust. And then there were the ballad singers, puppeteers, organ grinders, and beggars, many with talents but no audience, voices but no roof. They were the wanderers of a world that was quickly settling into cities and factories. And because they moved, they were often mistrusted. Laws were passed to restrict vagrancy. Some towns banned street selling altogether. Others demanded costly licenses that few could afford. Still, they kept moving. Take for example a man named Thomas, a real figure from 1840s Yorkshire whose name appeared in parish records as Tom the Scissors Man. He walked from farm to farm, sharpening blades for food or a few pence. He was known by locals, welcomed by some, shunned by others. He never married. He never stayed long. But during a harsh winter, when he didn't arrive as expected, a local farmer found his body curled beneath a hedgerow. He had frozen to death in the snow, alone, with his sharpening tools beside him. His story wasn't unique. Life on the road meant no protection. No home meant no fire on cold nights. No steady meals. No guarantee of rest. It meant you were always a visitor, never a neighbor. And still, many chose it, or were pushed into it, because the alternatives were worse. Debt, prison, starvation. For some, a life in motion was the only freedom they'd ever know. Among these groups, the Romani people stand out. Often referred to as gypsies, at the time, a term now recognized as derogatory. They traveled in tight-knit communities, carrying centuries-old traditions, languages, and skills. They sold horses, made baskets, entertained at fairs, but they also endured deep prejudice, forced evictions, and cultural erasure. Despite this, their stories and songs persisted, passed down around campfires, through whispered lullabies and carved wooden trinkets. And here lies a quiet truth. Those who walk the margins often see the world most clearly. They see the cruelty of rigid systems, but also the kindness of strangers. They learn resilience not from books, but from hunger and hope. Because surviving without shelter doesn't mean you lack purpose. It means you adapt, you listen, you find ways to belong in a world that rarely leaves room for those who wander. But while some traveled by choice, or by the pressure of circumstance, others were rooted in place, yet bound to the dirtiest, most thankless work imaginable. These were the men and boys who climbed chimneys, caught rats, and cleaned human waste from beneath the city's feet. Let's follow them next, into the shadows of soot, sewage, and survival, to understand the lives of those who worked where no one wanted to look. Not every job in the 19th century was dignified, nor clean, nor even visible to polite society. In fact, some of the most critical roles in the growing cities were the ones no one wanted to talk about, the jobs soaked in filth, shadowed in soot, or steeped in stench. But without these workers, the cities would have collapsed under their own waste. Let's begin with the night soil men. If you've never heard of them, that's by design. They were the invisible janitors of the urban world. Long before indoor plumbing, waste had to go somewhere, and often that somewhere was a wooden bucket beneath your bed. Night soil men came while the city slept, hauling human waste out of homes, carting it through dark streets, and dumping it, illegally or otherwise, beyond the city's edge. The work was backbreaking, and the smell clung to their clothes, their hands, their skin. They were shunned in public, even as their work kept public health barely afloat. Then there were the rat catchers. Cities like London and New York teemed with vermin. Rats spread disease, ruined food stores, and made homes unbearable. Catchers often worked with small dogs or ferrets, digging into foundations, crawling through alleys, sometimes even getting bitten. Some sold rats for blood sport. Rat baiting was, disturbingly, a form of public entertainment. Others worked alone, quietly, with a sack and a stick, disposing of dozens a day. And what about the chimney sweeps? Often children, some as young as 5, were forced to climb inside narrow chimney flues, scraping soot from within. Their knees bled, their lungs filled with black dust. Many developed chimney sweeps cancer, a horrific disease caused by constant exposure to soot. And yet, for a poor family, sending a child to sweep chimneys meant one less mouth to feed, and a few coins earned. One known case is that of a boy named William Carter, aged 7, who was employed in London to sweep chimneys in the early 1800s. He got stuck inside a flue and was trapped for hours before being pulled out, barely conscious. Covered in soot, sobbing, the master sweep scolded him for being too soft. William didn't survive to see his 12th birthday. His story wasn't unusual, it was common. And in the shadows of those same cities, there were toshers and mudlarks. Toshers scoured the sewers, waist-deep in disease and darkness, looking for coins, scraps of metal, or anything they could sell. Mudlarks, often children or elderly women, picked through riverbanks at low tide, scavenging nails, rope, and coal. Both jobs paid pennies. Both meant enduring the filth the rest of the world tried to ignore. Yet somehow, these workers were proud. They didn't have titles or uniforms, but they had grit. They kept cities livable, even if the cities never thanked them. Their work was dangerous, degrading, and deadly, but it was work. And for many, that was better than starvation. Here's the hard truth. Civilization has always relied on those willing to do the work others pretend doesn't exist. We build monuments to kings and inventors, but we forget the men who cleared the streets of waste or the children who cleaned the flues. They didn't leave journals, they left scars. But even among all this grit and grime, there was still tenderness. A chimney sweep might save a coin to buy bread for his sister. A tosher might share a find with someone hungrier than him. Even in the dirtiest corners, humanity flickered, and among those forgotten hands, there were many who belonged to women, doing work equally grueling, but often unpaid, unprotected, and unacknowledged. Let's now step into the world of seamstresses, washerwomen, and midwives, whose labor held up entire households, yet rarely earned them more than a coin or a whispered thanks. In the grand tapestry of 19th-century labor, women's work was the thread that held everything together, tight, quiet, and often unseen. They worked not in factories of iron and steam, nor in grand offices with ledgers and ink. Instead, their workplace was the kitchen, the laundry tub, the sewing bench, or a stranger's bedside in the dark hours of birth. Their jobs were called women's work, as if that somehow made them less vital, less grueling, or less deserving of recognition. Take the seamstress, for example. She wasn't the designer showcased in boutiques. She was the woman bent over a table in a dimly lit room, sewing by hand for 12 hours a day, patching sleeves, hemming skirts, mending coats. Often, she was paid by the piece, which meant every second mattered. Her fingers bled, her back ached, and still she stitched. In cities like London or New York, young girls as young as 12 took in garment work from middlemen, laboring late into the night just to make a few cents. They didn't ask for praise. They asked for enough to buy bread. Then there were the washerwomen, arguably some of the hardest working women of the era. With sleeves rolled up and arms soaked in icy water, they scrubbed strangers' clothing on washboards until their knuckles cracked. They lifted heavy pails, hung wet garments in biting wind, and started again the next day, all for a few pennies a load. Their backs bowed not from age, but from years bent over basins. Yet every clean collar and crisp sheet on a wealthy man's bed was a mark of their effort. And then, there were the midwives. Before hospitals and antiseptic and male-dominated medicine, there were women, ordinary women, who brought life into the world with only towels, herbs, steady hands, and steel nerves. Midwives weren't just birth attendants, they were confidants, nurses, spiritual anchors. They walked miles at midnight, carried lanterns through storms, and entered homes filled with both hope and fear. Many had no formal education, but generations of knowledge passed down through whispered teachings. They stood beside mothers when few others would. One such midwife was Granny Judith, remembered in the American South not for wealth or beauty, but because she delivered over 500 babies across 3 counties, many of them enslaved children born into suffering. She was illiterate, poor, and black, but in every cabin she entered, she was the one with authority. Life bowed to her, even when society would not. And yet, for all their labor, most of these women lived in poverty. They were considered helpers, not workers. Their jobs were dismissed as chores, their wages negligible, their voices rarely heard in courtrooms or newspapers. Many were widows or single mothers, doing everything they could to hold their families together while barely holding themselves upright. But here's the truth. Women's work was not soft. It was not secondary. It was foundational. Without it, homes would crumble, clothes would rot, babies would die, and society would stop functioning. And still, the divide was stark. A man's work was respected, titled, counted. A woman's work was expected and invisible. Yet, in every stitch sewn, every child caught, every shirt washed, there was quiet power, the power of endurance, of caretaking, of legacy. These women didn't build railroads, but they raised the men who did. Still, not every woman found herself bending over a wash tub or sewing by lamplight. Some walked darker paths, not by desire, but by desperation. When work couldn't feed you, when society judged your poverty more harshly than your choices, some women turned to the only trade that paid when all others closed their doors. Next, we step into the red light districts and narrow alleys to face one of the most complex and misunderstood forms of labor in history: sex work, and the women who lived between survival and shame. In the shadows of every grand avenue and behind the doors that no one dared name, there existed a world where survival and judgment collided, a world of women who sold what society demanded and then condemned. Sex work in the 19th century was not new. It was as old as the cities themselves. But during this era of corsets and moral codes, of lace gloves and whispered scandal, it became the clearest reflection of a brutal double standard. For many women, sex work wasn't a choice. It was the last option when every door had closed. When seamstress pay couldn't buy bread. When laundry jobs disappeared. When a husband drank away the rent or a father left nothing behind. The street became the fallback. Not because it was safe or easy, but because it paid. Cities like London, Paris, and New York all had their infamous red light districts: Soho, Storyville, 5 Points. In these quarters, women stood under gas lamps or peered from brothel windows, hoping for a customer who wouldn't hurt them, cheat them, or bring the police. Some worked under madams who took a portion of their earnings. Others walked the streets alone, vulnerable to weather, disease, and violence. One woman named Maggie, who lived in New York's notorious Tenderloin district in the 1870s, left behind fragments of her life in court documents. Arrested multiple times for public lewdness, she told one judge that she earned more in one night than a factory paid her in a week. "I don't like it," she said, "but it's the only thing between me and hunger." There is no record of what became of Maggie. Most women like her disappeared into history, nameless, faceless, but real. And while these women faced fines, beatings, and disease, their clients, the wealthy, the powerful, the same men who wrote laws and preached morality, often walked away untouched. Society judged the women harshly, but rarely spoke of the men. A woman caught in sex work was labeled ruined. A man who visited her was just careless. The double standard was not just social, it was legal. In Britain, the Contagious Diseases Acts allowed authorities to forcibly examine and detain suspected sex workers to control venereal disease, without requiring proof or consent. No such measures were applied to the men who visited them. The law didn't protect these women. It punished them. And yet, even within these harsh realities, there was tenderness. Women formed informal networks, looking out for each other, warning of violent clients, sharing food and warmth when they could. Some madams treated their workers like family. Others exploited them, just like in any profession. There was no single story. But what unites many of these stories is the silence history wraps around them. Because these women weren't supposed to exist, not in polite conversation, not in family trees, not in respectable memory, but they did, and they mattered. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Sex work existed not because of moral decay, but because of economic desperation and societal hypocrisy. These women didn't break the rules. They were crushed by them, and then punished for surviving. Their stories challenge us to ask, who gets to decide what is respectable work? Who gets to survive with dignity, and who must pay a price for the same? And while some women navigated city streets and scandal, others moved in places of quiet power, not through seduction, but through scholarship, skill, and spoken word. They were teachers, doctors, and preachers, though the road to those professions was longer and lonelier than most could bear. Let's now step into a different chamber of 19th century labor, the world of doctors with clean cuffs, lawyers with trimmed beards, and clergy whose words shaped minds and morals. Because even among professions deemed noble, class and access played a cruel game. In a world divided by class and toil, there stood a narrow staircase that seemed to climb a little higher than the rest, leading not to factories or fires, but to clean offices, polished shoes, and handwritten letters of introduction. These were the professions of prestige: doctors, lawyers, and preachers, roles that didn't just earn respect, but shaped the rules and rhythms of society itself. But prestige, like everything in the 19th century, came at a price, not of merit, but of access. To become a doctor meant years of study, which meant tuition, which meant family wealth. Medical schools weren't overflowing with students from working-class homes. They were filled with sons of the educated elite, men who could afford to learn Latin and anatomy instead of working in coal shafts. The profession promised purpose and reputation, but it also mirrored the social divides it claimed to heal. For every man who cured disease in a hospital, there were 100 sick poor who couldn't afford to be seen by him. Still, some defied the pattern. One such example is Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman in the United States to earn a medical degree. In 1849, she graduated alone among hundreds of men, having been mocked, rejected, and told repeatedly that medicine was no place for a lady. And yet, she persisted. She opened clinics for poor women and trained future female doctors, not just proving her worth, but widening the door behind her. Law, too, was a field of power and gatekeeping. A lawyer was not just a man with knowledge, but with language. He wore the right suit, knew the right handshake, spoke in courtrooms where few others could. The laws he studied were written by men like him, for men like him. And yet, in every city, there were attorneys who tried to break that mold, defending immigrants, standing against corrupt landlords, risking their careers for a deeper kind of justice. But not all prestige came with profit. The preacher held sway not with law or science, but with words and spirit. In small towns and slums alike, the church was often the only institution that reached across class lines. A preacher might come from humble beginnings but rise to lead hundreds in Sunday sermons. In African American communities, especially after emancipation in the U.S., black preachers became not just spiritual leaders but political voices, educators, and organizers, speaking truth in places where silence had once ruled. These professions held influence, yes, but they were also heavy with responsibility. A doctor who erred, a lawyer who lied, a preacher who judged too harshly, each could harm the very people they were sworn to help. And sometimes, prestige insulated them from consequences. There's a story, half history, half parable, about a rural preacher in 1850s Kentucky. He delivered fiery sermons against sin, condemning women who bore children out of wedlock. Yet, when his own daughter became pregnant by a local farmer, he sent her away in shame, never speaking her name again. His congregation praised his moral stance, but his daughter's name was forgotten. Here lies a lesson. Prestige can offer protection, but it can also blind. Titles don't guarantee virtue. Respectability doesn't equal justice. And those who hold influence must be watched just as carefully as those who hold none. Still, in the best of these professions, there was deep goodness. A doctor who visited homes without charging, a lawyer who defended the voiceless, a preacher who welcomed outcasts and spoke of mercy instead of punishment. But not all labor in the 19th century was protected by title or robed in authority. Some of it was stolen. Some of it was coerced. And for millions, there was no wage to chase, only chains to bear. Let us now step into the most painful and haunting corner of 19th century labor. The world of enslaved people and forced laborers, those whose bodies were owned, whose families were torn apart, and whose contributions were erased, even as they laid the very foundation of modern economies. Not all work in the 19th century was chosen. Some of it was stolen, from the body, from the will, from the soul, beneath the pride of nations, the rise of industries, and the myths of progress. There were millions who labored without consent, without pay, without freedom. Their sweat built plantations, railroads, and empires, but their names, most of them, were never carved into stone. They were enslaved, exploited, forgotten. In the American South, slavery was not a remnant of the past. It was the very engine of its economy. On cotton plantations stretching from Georgia to Louisiana, enslaved men, women, And children worked from sunrise to beyond sunset, planting, picking, hauling, processing. Their backs were bent under a sun that offered no mercy. Their hands bloodied from the raw fibers. And their dignity, crushed daily by a system that treated them as property. One man named Josiah Henson, born into slavery in Maryland, later escaped and wrote of his life. He described how, as a child, he watched his father receive 100 lashes for defending his mother against an overseer. His father was maimed and sold. His mother wept but could not speak out. Josiah's words were calm, measured, but beneath them lay grief no human should endure. His story would later inspire Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. But Josiah was real, and he was just one of millions. Even after slavery was legally abolished in the U.S. in 1865. Exploitation continued. Sharecropping replaced bondage with debt. Convict leasing turned prisons into labor camps. Freed people found that freedom came with new chains, poverty, violence, laws designed to keep them in their place. And across the world, forced labor took other shapes. In British colonies, indentured laborers from India were sent to sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Their contracts binding them for years. Many died before they could return home. In Africa and Southeast Asia, colonial powers extracted rubber, minerals, timber, using local populations under threat of violence or starvation. It wasn't called slavery, but it smelled the same. There were also children, orphans taken from city streets and shipped to farms in Canada or Australia. Promised a better life but used as unpaid workers. Their childhoods were traded for crops and profit. And while men toiled in fields or mines, women and girls were often exploited in brothels, sweatshops, and domestic servitude. Many had no legal protection. Few had anyone to tell. But even within this darkness, there were sparks of resistance. People who ran, people who fought, people who wrote their names into history not with pens, but with footsteps toward freedom. Harriet Tubman was one such name. Born into slavery, she escaped, and then returned again and again to free others. She carried no weapons but her will, no riches but her courage. She risked everything, not for gain, but because she believed no one should live in chains. And that's the lesson carved deep into the heart of this chapter. Labor is not always noble. Not when it's taken, not when it's forced. Progress built on pain is not progress, it's theft. History often paints the 19th century as a time of innovation, growth, and glory. But look closer, and you'll see hands tied, backs scarred, eyes hollowed by centuries of injustice. The monuments we admire often stand on the bones of those who had no choice but to build them. But change was coming, slowly, stubbornly, not from those in power, but from the people themselves. Workers began to speak, to organize, to demand dignity not as a favor, but as a right. Now, we step into the final turning point of this journey, into union halls and protest marches. Into whispered plans and printed leaflets. Let's meet the rebels, the reformers, and the ones who rose not with weapons, but with voices. Those who said, enough. We deserve better. We build the world. We will no longer be silent. For generations, people had bent their backs in silence, sowing fields they didn't own, scrubbing floors they couldn't afford to walk on, building industries that offered no return but exhaustion. But eventually, something shifted, not in the halls of government, not in the mansions of the wealthy, but in the hearts of ordinary people. It started as a whisper, passed between tired hands, then it grew into a question. What if we said no? The rise of labor unions in the 19th century didn't happen all at once. It was not a single strike or a single speech. It was thousands of moments, scattered across cities and countries, where people decided that enough was enough, that their labor was not a gift, it was a necessity, and that if the world couldn't run without them, then maybe it should start listening to them. In England, coal miners in the north began organizing into trade unions as early as the 1820s. They demanded safer conditions, shorter hours, and fair pay, not because they believed the system would grant it, but because they had nothing left to lose. In the United States, textile workers, many of them immigrant women, held strikes in Massachusetts mills, raising their voices against 14-hour workdays and windowless factories. One such strike happened in 1844 in Lowell, Massachusetts. Led largely by young women known as mill girls. They printed leaflets, marched in the streets, and spoke publicly, something considered scandalous for women at the time. They didn't win immediate reforms, but they planted a seed, a belief that voices, when joined, carried weight. In Chicago, in the 1880s, ironworkers and carpenters formed federations that would eventually shape the American Federation of Labor. They lobbied for the 8-hour workday, for worker protections, for weekends, ideas we now take for granted but were once seen as radical dreams. And it wasn't just industrial workers. Farm laborers, teachers, domestic servants, even newspaper printers, all began forming collectives, sharing strategies, and supporting each other across trades. What had once been isolation became community. Of course, not everyone welcomed this change. Strikers were beaten, union leaders were jailed, some were killed. In 1886, the Haymarket Affair in Chicago ended in bloodshed when a peaceful rally turned violent after a bomb was thrown. Police opened fire. Protesters were arrested. The headlines painted workers as dangerous. But the movement didn't die. It hardened. And it spread. In Britain, the match girls' strike of 1888 brought attention to the appalling conditions in a match factory where women suffered from phossy jaw, a disfiguring disease caused by white phosphorus. These young women walked out, not for better wages, but to live without pain. Their bravery captured national attention and led to real reform. These were not politicians or generals. They were laundry workers, teachers, bricklayers. But they changed the course of history. Not because they were loud, but because they were many. Not because they were perfect, but because they were united. And here's the truth that came out of all their struggle. Power isn't only held by those at the top. It is built, every day, by those who show up, who work, who endure. And when those people speak together, even the highest walls can crack. The lesson here is simple but eternal. Dignity is not a luxury. It is a right, and it was the bravery of ordinary workers, not just reformers or rebels, that dragged that truth into the light. Still, change didn't erase the past. It didn't undo the centuries of division, or class, or suffering, but it offered something new, the idea that work could be fair, that voices could matter, that the story could change. And now, as we close this journey through the laboring lives of the 19th century, we return to one final question. What has really changed? How much of that old world still lingers in the one we live in today? Let's take one last step, into reflection, into memory, into the truth we still carry with us. In the 19th century, class wasn't just something you were born into, it was something you wore, spoke, and performed every single day. Long before anyone asked what your job was, they noticed the cut of your coat, the rhythm of your speech, the polish of your boots. In a world obsessed with appearances, status was a language, and everyone was expected to speak it fluently or pay the price. For the upper classes, every detail was curated. A gentleman's cravat was tied just so. A lady's gloves were spotless, even if they never touched anything. Walking too fast, laughing too loudly, or forgetting the right fork could signal you didn't belong. There were rules within rules, unwritten codes passed down from finishing schools and family parlors, where the slightest mistake could mark you as not one of us. And it wasn't just about clothing. It was about posture, accent, vocabulary. A clipped, refined British accent meant access. A regional drawl meant limits. In America, too, elocution classes thrived, promising ambitious middle-class families that the right tone of voice could smooth over humble beginnings. Even handwriting mattered. A flowing, elegant script suggested education and taste. A messy scrawl? Ignorance. In some offices, people were hired or rejected solely based on the appearance of their penmanship. But symbols weren't only for the rich. Working-class people had their own codes. Calloused hands spoke of honest labor. A patched coat carefully mended, was a quiet badge of resilience. A woman's apron, still damp from laundry, told stories of endurance that silk could never carry. Pride wasn't found in polish, but in survival. Still, the power of appearance could not be underestimated. There's a true story of a young seamstress named Nora in Manchester. She was talented, precise, and worked in a shop sewing fine dresses for wealthy women. But one day, she made the mistake of greeting a client too casually, dropping a "Miss" and speaking with the plain honesty of her upbringing. She was dismissed the next day, not for her stitching, but for her tone. In that world, talent came second, manner came first, and so people learned to perform. Middle-class women mimicked the walk of their wealthier peers. Clerks copied the speech of their managers. Even servants practiced speaking nicely, in hopes of earning better placement. It was exhausting, and yet, to climb even an inch, many believed they had no choice. Because in the 19th century, status wasn't only about money. It was about perception. You could have just enough to eat, but still be shunned if your boots weren't shined. You could be rich from trade, but considered vulgar if you lacked the polish of old blood. And that's the lesson here. Class is not just economic. It's cultural. It's coded into the smallest habits: what you wear to dinner, how you pronounce a word, whether you know when to speak and when to stay silent. And these codes, though unspoken, can be just as powerful as any law. Even today, we carry traces of this. We still make assumptions based on clothing, accents, vocabulary. We praise those who carry themselves well, and question those who don't fit neatly into our idea of success. The corsets are gone, but the pressure to present a certain image? Still here. And yet, in every generation, there are those who resist, who refuse to play by rules that were never made for them. Some push back not with silence, but with speech, not with polished shoes, but with protest. They stand at the edge of systems and say, "We built this world too, and we deserve to be heard." And so we arrive at the final chapter. A reflection, a reckoning. After all we've seen, all we've remembered, what have we truly learned? Let us now take one last step into the present, where the ghosts of class still whisper. And where the question remains, how far have we really come? We like to believe we've moved beyond the old world, that the soot-streaked class divides of the 19th century belong to history books. Not the world outside our windows. But listen closely, and you'll still hear the echoes. They're softer now, wrapped in modern language and polished packaging. But they're there, in the schools we attend, the jobs we respect, the homes we can, or cannot, afford. Class hasn't vanished, it's just changed its clothes. Today, we no longer speak of maids and mistresses, of chimney sweeps and lords. But we still instinctively sort people: white collar and blue collar, well spoken and rough around the edges. We admire ambition, but only when it's wrapped in the right accent, the right degree, the right backstory. A child born in a wealthy zip code is more likely to go to a top university, get hired at a competitive firm, and own a home by 30. A child born in poverty, despite intelligence, drive, and grit, often must climb twice as far with half the rope. Sound familiar? It's not so different from the servant girl polishing silver while the lady's children learn French upstairs. Even in language, class reveals itself. We say someone made it out of a rough neighborhood, as though success is escape. We call certain jobs menial, as if dignity depends on a keyboard, not a broom. We admire CEOs and surgeons, but rarely applaud the janitor who cleans the hallway outside their office. Though one could not function without the other. And then there's education. In the 1800s, reading and writing were marks of privilege. Today, access to quality education still hinges on income, geography, and even the shape of your family. A bright student in a struggling school district might never reach their full potential, not for lack of talent, but lack of resources. And just like before, the system quietly nods and moves on. Take the story of Lena. a first-generation college student whose parents worked long hours cleaning houses. She earned a scholarship to a prestigious university. But when she got there, she felt out of place. Her clothes were simple, her accent was different, and when asked where her parents worked, she hesitated. She graduated with honors, but she never forgot what it felt like to sit in a room and feel invisible, not because she wasn't smart, but because she didn't fit. And that's the quiet lesson history keeps trying to teach us. Class isn't only about wealth. It's about access, language, confidence, recognition. It's about who feels at home, and who feels like they've walked into someone else's house with muddy shoes. The world may no longer divide people with titles and top hats. But we still divide them. By expectations, by assumption, and perhaps most cruelly, by the belief that some people simply belong in certain places, and others don't. But history doesn't just haunt us. It teaches us. It gives us a chance to do better. To notice the hierarchies we've normalized. To honor the work that goes unseen. To redefine success, not as how far you rise, but how many people you bring with you. Because when we look back at the stories we've explored, the miners, the maids, the midwives, the rebels, we realize that dignity was never about status. It was about effort, kindness, perseverance, and those things? They're timeless. So perhaps the question isn't just, what has changed, but rather, what will we choose to change now? And with that, our journey through the many lives of the 19th century draws to a close. But the work of remembering, of honoring, and of reimagining, that work has only just begun. So now, here we are, at the end of a long road paved with soot-stained fingers, calloused palms, whispered prayers, and the quiet courage of ordinary people. We've traveled from mansions to mines, from drawing rooms to factory floors, from the hands of the elite to the hands of those who were never supposed to be seen. And the question lingers like smoke in the distance. What has changed, and what hasn't? Today, we have labor laws. Child labor is banned in most places. Workdays have limits. Most jobs come with some form of protection, at least on paper. And thanks to generations who marched, wrote, fought, and organized, workers have more rights now than at any point in modern history. We no longer send chimney boys up flues or make women sew until their fingers bleed in freezing attics, at least. Not in most parts of the world. But if you look closely enough, you'll still see echoes. In a garment factory overseas, a girl not much older than Eliza sits bent over a sewing machine for pennies a shirt. In a mining town, laborers still risk their lives to extract wealth they'll never own. In wealthy cities, domestic workers, often immigrants, clean homes they'll never live in, raising children who are not theirs while their own children wait oceans away. Even in offices and tech hubs, where the work is cleaner and the coffee stronger, the weight of class and access still lingers. Some climb quickly, others hit glass ceilings, and many still live paycheck to paycheck, even while holding multiple jobs. The latter still exists, it's just made of different materials. And yet, for all that remains broken, there is also something remarkable: the resilience of those who labor. From the seamstress to the surgeon, the coal miner to the coder, work continues to shape identity, community, and purpose. But the most important lesson may be this: work is never just about tasks. It's about dignity, about recognition, about being seen. And when systems erase the worker, whether by class, gender, or race, something vital is lost. Not just for them, but for all of us. So the next time you pass someone sweeping a floor, delivering a package, caring for an elderly patient, or fixing a pipe in your home, remember this: history isn't just made in palaces or parliaments. It is made in aprons, boots, and overalls. It is carried on backs and through generations. And maybe, just maybe, you'll ask yourself one more question. If I had been born in 1850, what job would I have had? And what kind of life would I have been allowed to live? Thank you for walking this journey. The past is never truly past, it lives in the way we work, the way we dream, and the way we fight for a better world. And that fight, as always, begins with remembering. Stay curious, stay kind, and never forget the hands that built the world beneath your feet.